children born years ago in the small town below the hill grew up with a terrifying urban legend, the legend of a white-robed woman whose spirit wanders in the forests above the hill, while her stillborn fetus, attached to her body by the umbilical cord, follows her on the ground, a legend known as the Curse of Abigail. For this reason, the locals refused going up the hill after dark and considered it ominous, not only because of fear of Abigail's curse, but also due to the gruesome fate of the religious and reclusive villagers who once lived on top of the hill. After Abigail's death, no newborns were born in the village unless they were dead. If a child happened to be born alive, they would be killed by their mother a few days later, because she did not consider them human offspring. But calling the hilltop village ominous had a more important reason: the sudden and mysterious disappearance of the villagers on a winter night in 1940. The news was printed in a local newspaper but soon disappeared along the headlines of World War II, and years later, with the change of the hill's name to Paradise, its dark past vanished along with its people. These stories, mostly mythical in nature, were the only information Patterson had gathered during his investigation into the house on the hill. Apart from the three families who had lived in the house on the hill from the 1960s to the present day, there was no other information about the original residents of the house and the vanished villagers, especially a girl named Abigail. But Patterson was sure of one thing. What Sam had described in the recorded video on his phone was exactly what local people had talked about for years: Abigail and her dead child. What had been considered folklore and superstitions by Patterson until 2 days ago now seemed more real than every reason and evidence he had. As he stood in the dark and desolate basement of the only remaining house from the cursed village, staring at the crooked and twisted writing seemingly etched in blood on the basement's cement floor, he tried to solve the puzzle and put an end to the nightmare of the house on the hill, which he now realized he was a part of. The curse is not gone. Elias's voice came through Sam's phone. Patterson pulled out the phone from his pocket in surprise. The video had started playing from where Patterson had last paused it. Patterson unintentionally stared at the video. He had watched the video carefully several times, but this time something had changed. Between the severe shaking of the camera at the end of the video, something appeared for a brief moment that Patterson had never seen before. He had to rewind the video several times until he finally froze the image. He stared at the image and his face was covered with surprise. Patterson now understood the reason for Sam and Elias's horror and escape from the basement. Right at the moment they exited the basement, on the lowest step, a figure was seen, with tangled black hair covering her disfigured face, while her hands were placed on the basement steps to pull herself up. Patterson was sure he was staring at Abigail's face. But there was something even more bizarre in the video, a warning that Sam had uttered to Elias before Abigail appeared: "Behind you." Patterson had heard this sentence in the video before, but only once. This time, however, the sentence was repeated constantly, and Patterson felt sure that the audience at that moment was not Elias, but himself. The sound of heavy chains being dragged on the ground coming from behind him could only mean one thing. He cast a quick glance over his shoulder. The only thing that caught his eye for a moment under the light of the flashlight was part of a human body hastily retreating under the old bed, like an animal hiding itself from the light. Despite multiple searches and meticulous documentation of the basement's every corner, Patterson was certain the thick, rusted chain now disappearing under the bed had never been there before. Patterson knew all of these were hallucinations that had come to him after entering the house on the hill, but perhaps the clue he was looking for could be found within these hallucinations. That's why he was drawn towards the bed. He knelt in front of the bed. Slowly, he lifted the bedsheet and looked underneath. But apart from some stuff, There was nothing visible because he had chosen the wrong place to search. He realized this when a part of the bed sheet he was holding slipped quietly through his fingers, making him to lift his head. What he saw was unbelievable. Emerging from the center of the bed was a figure, its form becoming recognizable within moments. Bony legs, one dripping with blood and shackled, accompanied by the ghastly sight of a decaying fetus, greeted Patterson's horrified gaze. He got up from his place, and for a moment, he stared at the motionless figure of Abigail, then attempted to pull the bedsheet aside, but suddenly Abigail lunged towards him. Patterson immediately threw himself backward, and as the flashlight slipped from his hand, he quickly drew his gun and fired 2 shots into the darkness. The sound of gunfire echoing in the confined space disoriented him for a moment, and when he regained his senses, he saw 2 armed officers standing over him in the dark and cluttered basement. The bed was neatly made, and except for the 2 bullet holes created by the gunfire on the bedsheet, there was no sign of the events that had occurred just minutes ago. The light coming from the basement entrance indicated that several hours had passed, and it was now morning. The officers had rushed into the basement upon hearing the sound of gunfire to investigate further. Patterson, ignoring the officers' questions at that moment, was only thinking of one thing. Now that he had seen everything with his own eyes and had no doubt that the legend of Abigail had roots in reality, then what had been said about the cause of Abigail's death could also be true. Death during an exorcism ritual. Only priests were allowed to perform exorcisms, and that too with the permission of the local bishop. This was what led Patterson to the cathedral to gather more information about the legend of Abigail and the events that had happened in the village nearly 80 years ago. But the only achievement of Patterson's short conversation with the bishop was a name: Father Brian, the 40-year-old priest of the village who apparently had nothing unusual in his life. He had returned to the cathedral in 1940 after losing his eyesight due to an illness, and had spent the rest of his relatively long life there until 2010. However, as Patterson walked down the narrow hallway of the old cathedral towards the exit door, he was certain of one thing: that the old bishop of the cathedral was hiding something about Father Brian and the events that had happened in the village. He understood this from the change in the bishop's expression when he heard the name Abigail, and of course his opposition to Patterson's further investigation into Father Brian. This concealment alone prompted Patterson to seek help from a priest named Father Philip, whom he had met years ago during an investigation, to gather more information about Father Brian. Why were the Hoffman family, among the 3 families residing in the house on the hill, were condemned to death? The identity of the unknown person presents in the photo, related to the gathering marked with a question mark, and most importantly, where did Sam and Elias go after fleeing from the house? These were important questions that Patterson sought answers to during the time he was waiting for a call from Father Philip at his temporary residence, and he was sure that they all lead to one thing: the beginning of the legend of Abigail. It was past 7 in the evening when Patterson realized, through a call from Father Philip, that the case he was involved in had more to it than he initially had thought. The cathedral strangely refused to provide any information about Father Brian, but Father Philip had managed to gather information through a friend in the cathedral. Father Brian had spent the last 5 years of his life confined to a separate room in the cathedral due to what was referred to as madness and schizophrenia, and no one, except the young monk named Daniel, who was responsible for his care, had the right to meet him. Daniel was the last person who had been with Father Brian, and perhaps he held the answers to some of Patterson's questions. But after Father Brian's death, Daniel had left the church and no one knew of his whereabouts. A remote family farm was the only address Patterson could find for Daniel, and decided to make his way there. As Patterson drove through the narrow dirt road leading to the farm, the fog had enveloped everything, and while he kept his eyes on the road, he engaged in a conversation on the phone with his young assistant, Martha, who had been tasked with handling mysterious cases that had remained unsolved over the years and could be related to the house on the hill by him. Among the cases Martha had reviewed, a few had caught Patterson's attention. 2 suspicious murders and 3 suicides that had occurred in various cities and over different years. The victims included both men and women, all of them young, and except for one case, they had nothing in common. They were all orphans, or had grown up in orphanages, or had been entrusted to families as adopted children. In one of the cases, the father had hanged himself after the murder of his only child. As Patterson got out of the car, he could only think of one thing: the resemblance of these 5 cases to Dr. Jones's death. The farmhouse was barely visible in the dim light among the fog. Patterson entered the farm and headed straight for a light that was flickering in the midst of the fog. From the same eerie surroundings, he could recognize that he was stepping into a dried-up cornfield. He had taken a few more steps when the sound of something falling to the ground made him stop in his tracks and gaze at a point amidst the cornstalks. Without a doubt, what he saw was the remains of a disfigured and decomposed scarecrow that had fallen to the ground just a moment ago. But even the most pragmatic mind like Patterson's couldn't ignore the sound of footsteps behind him heading towards the house. As he reached the wooden house in the middle of the farm, the first thing that caught his eye was the appearance of the house. Besides a large wooden cross installed on the roof of the house, there were numerous pendants and symbols of strange shapes hanging from the eaves of the house, which Patterson had become quite familiar with during this time: demon repellents. He didn't hear any response when he knocked, so he entered. It felt as if he had traveled back in time 100 years. The only source of light in the house was a few small candles placed on a small wooden dining table in the middle of the house. And there was nothing in the house besides that same table and a small, simple kitchen. Nothing escaped his notice as his gaze settled on a handmade wooden coffin leaning against the wall at the end of the hall. He was staring at the empty coffin when suddenly a sound similar to a whip led him to a room at the end of the narrow hallway. In the semi-dark room, he noticed a half-naked man with his back to him, whipping himself in front of a wooden crucifix hanging on the wall, the same practice that some Christians perform for repentance. But at that moment, the injured and bloodied man was the least of Patterson's concerns. On the contrary, his gaze was curious as he observed numerous photos covering the walls of the room. It wasn't hard for Patterson to recognize at first glance that each set of photos formed a family tree that included several generations. Alongside the photos of all the individuals, their names were written, and the red cross marked on most of their faces could only have one meaning: death. What Patterson saw before him seemed all too familiar. He took out the photo of the gathering from his jacket pocket and stared at it. The same pen, the same handwriting. In the corner to the left of the photo, among the darkness and a little further away from the rest, stood a young man who was barely visible at first glance, as if intentionally avoiding being seen. He was the only one in the photo who wasn't smiling, and instead of facing the camera, had his cold gaze fixed on the others, the same person marked with a question mark next to his image. And now he stood in front of Patterson, with his cold and lifeless face, having stopped whipping himself, and dressed in the same attire worn by Christian monks. Daniel's eyes only said one thing: he had been waiting for Patterson.